DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574 today. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane.
Do you want to know what's happening in the Finger Lakes? We do too. We're going in depth with decision makers in the heart of upstate New York to get the answers you need. From the team of FingerLakes1.com, this is Inside the FLX.
Today on the show, we're talking about the housing crisis here in the Finger Lakes. For several years now, homeownership rates have been in decline. This while the rate of rent-burdened households, or those that spend 50% or more of their household income on rent, tick upward. It's a combination with far-reaching impacts on economic development, community sustainability, school districts, and more. Last year, the finishing touches were put on one of the most comprehensive housing studies in upstate New York. It was done in Ontario County, where working class housing, the stuff that is vital in a tourism-centric economy or one that wants to grow, has become scarcer and scarcer. But perhaps the most notable finding was that despite what many have viewed as a surge in higher-priced homes in Ontario County, there was even a shortage of those too. What's next? How does Ontario County plan to work with cities, towns, and villages to address the shortages in housing? This conversation on Inside the FLX is a first of several, which will feature officials from Ontario County's ad-hoc committee on housing, plus others as they begin a public outreach campaign to help communities better understand the challenges and what they can do ahead. My guests this hour include Chris DeBolt, Ontario County Administrator, Jim Yockel, CEO of the Greater Rochester Association of Realtors, and the chair of this new ad hoc committee, and Ryan Davis, Director of Economic Development. We pick up the conversation with a look at how we got here and why a housing study was commissioned in the first place.
This is a unique project for the county, and we're excited to kind of take it to the next step. So how we got where we are today, I started my role as county administrator for Ontario County in December of 2020. And literally from probably the first week on the job, I noticed a reoccurring theme through every conversation I had, whether it was with community leaders or other department heads or even my personal family trying to find a home when we relocated back to Ontario County. And that was housing, right? So it came up in economic development, conversations with employers who said, I've got 30 openings, or I could expand and I could create 20, 15, 50 new jobs, but I can't find people because the employees that I have can't afford to live in Ontario County. Our DSS commissioner reporting out every 3 weeks to the Health and Human Services Committee about the increasing population of homeless individuals and, more importantly, families that her department was struggling to help. Our mental health department, people struggling with mental health issues who might have been pushed over the edge by loss of housing and those kind of things. And so again, through all these conversations I had with community leaders, stakeholders, department heads within the county, this reoccurring theme of a lack of housing within the county emerged. And so we just had those conversations with the Board of Supervisors on a regular basis. And those conversations started in early 2021. And then by the spring of 2022, the Board of Supervisors was saying they were agreeing with everything we said because they were hearing it from their constituents at the town level as well. And so we did an RFP. In the summer of 22, we awarded the contract to a firm called Urban Partners out of Philadelphia to come in and do this, what we called housing assessment. And we worked on that from the late summer of 2022 through the end of 2023. And I've been doing local government, county level government stuff for almost 20 years now. It was probably the most robust public outreach and thorough analysis of an issue as broad as housing that I've ever been involved in. We did multiple rounds of public input. We did stakeholder meetings with developers, with people associated with nonprofits and housings and community groups and just regular citizens. We did a public survey where we mailed out and put online a survey, and we got over 1,000 responses. And throughout that entire process of almost 18 months of doing this, it resonated with every person that we talked to. They said, yes, this is a major issue in our community. Yes, this is a major issue for the people that I work with on a daily basis. So we went through that process. Then we did 4 public community meetings as we rolled out the findings of the assessment to kind of truth the data, right? Sometimes you can get a little academic, you can get a little isolated, you come up with all this data and then you roll it out and people say, that's not what I see. It's the first time in my career we've ever rolled out anything like that. And to a person, every single stakeholder we talked to in those 4 community meetings was like, yeah, that sounds right. Yes, that's what I'm seeing. Yes, that's what I feel in my community. Or I have a young professional child who's trying to move back to the area and they can't. And so they've ended up somewhere else. So we wrapped all that up at the end of 23 with the Board of Supervisors. And now we've been kind of in this 5-month period of digesting everything in the assessment, talking to the Board of Supervisors, talking at a staff level, and now we're ready to kind of move it to that next step of what do we do about it? We've all got consensus. We've got a great data set. We've got a very thorough assessment of kind of the picture of where it stands. We've identified some potential opportunities. We've identified where the pinch points are. Now we're in that, okay, how do we move forward? How do we start to address this? How do we make it better for the community? And that's why I think it's so exciting that we're here talking to you today, because that's what we're on the precipice of okay, we all know it's a problem. We all agree on the problem. We all know roughly what the boundaries of the problem are. Now, how do we start making it better?
Yeah. Jim, zooming out a little bit, given your background, what's unique or maybe not about Ontario County's housing situation?
I think that's the challenge is this is not unique to Ontario County. We cover all the way from Batavia to Auburn down to the Pennsylvania border, and this is happening everywhere. What I do think is unique to Ontario County is how far you've come and the effort you've put in. So the study that Chris mentioned was fantastic. And I went to one of the public forums, and it's really encouraging for us as housing providers to see somebody so committed to fixing this problem.
Yeah. Ryan, in terms of the study, where do we stand right now, right this second?
So the short answer is we had our first ad hoc committee meeting last week. But getting there, as Chris mentioned, it was a few months worth of a process. We wrapped up the study October-ish, wheeled it out to the Board of Supervisors for them to start to act. And part of the study had some recommendations to it. And one of those recommendations was you have to put at least a group of people together to start to deal with this initially. And what comes from that would be what's next. So right after the study, and I go back to telling the story quite often, a group of people from Bloomfield, Grow Bloomfield, asked for us to do a little public rollout of their own. And said I had presented to Grow Bloomfield before for economic development, and it was 8 or 10 people in a room, and it was a Wednesday night in Bloomfield. How many people could actually be there? There was over 50, and we had a staff meeting the very next day about the housing study. And I said, we have to rethink everything, because there was just 50 plus people in Bloomfield talking about housing. We're not ready. And so we started to put together the idea of what has become known as the ad hoc committee, and took it to the Board of Supervisors with some recommendations as to how it would be set up, who would be on it, asked for some of their input. They gave us input back. We went back to them again through HHS and Planning Environmental Quality Committees. And then they gave us some more recommendations and their thoughts. And then at the end of it, we came up with a group of people that will cover, we've got 2 supervisors on there, some housing advocates, community members, staff members, that all got together last Thursday evening and had the initial ad hoc conversation. And it was a great back and forth. Coming from the staff level, we've had the opportunity to deal with this for 2 years. Yep. As a matter of fact, Chris told me before I even started that I was going to be working on this. So we've had the opportunity to have those conversations. Not everybody on this committee has had the opportunity to talk to each other about housing. So there was an agenda, and we kind of stuck to it. But there was an awful lot of almost the airing of the grievances, right? We have to level set what everybody's thoughts are on housing, what's needed, what we should do. And it became more of an aspirational meeting so we could get to action items. So that's kind of where we are right now with it.
And before we get into, we're going to talk a lot about communication and process and everything like that here coming up. But first, I just want to ask sort of all three of you, when you look at the housing study, it's a massive study, 160 plus pages, right, Ryan? What were each of your biggest takeaways from it? Ryan, I guess we'll start with you. What were if there was one thing that stood out most to you from it, what was it?
I think Chris mentioned it earlier. It was shocking how close the public outreach part and the survey data was to the actual data. What people feel is the issue actually is the issue. From the economic development department standpoint, we're hearing it near daily. I can't find people to fill positions. And part of the reason is they don't have a place to live. That Bloomfield meeting, we had owner of a small family farm that had 5 people working on it previously, and now they can't come up with 2 or 3 to help them work it. And it's because they can't find a place to live in Bloomfield. And where they can find a place to live, they have to pass a dozen family farms. Why wouldn't they go work there?
Yeah.
So that's the takeaway that I had. But the true feeling of the community matches the issue that we're trying to tackle.
Yeah. And Jim, in your space, I'm curious, are there specific holes in the market, so to speak? Or like when you look at this report, what stands out to you?
The biggest thing for me was confirmation of what we anecdotally knew. We talked to people who are in the market all the time and knew there was a shortage, and knew there was a problem specifically in Ontario County. But to have a high quality consultant with a rigorous study to confirm all of that was really helpful for us. And I think the area that is most in crisis right now is that middle market, the 150 to 250 market, because it's nearly impossible to build anything new that you can sell in that price range. But that's the price range that's most in demand. So what we see across the region is this mismatch where people who want to buy in that range are forced down. You can't be forced up because you can't afford it, but they're forced down. And so they start competing with the people who are in the 100 to 150 range and pushes them down. So everything gets squeezed to the edges. And the study was good confirmation that there just aren't any options in that market. And it's a huge challenge because it's not an easy solution, but that's kind of what we felt. And now we have, academic quality research to prove that. Yeah.
And I guess to a lot of listeners and viewers who are hearing you say that, they're going to say to themselves, well, wait a second. Where are these houses? Because that has to also be the smallest share of market that exists in any current real estate market, right?
In the resale market, because the price has been increasing, we're getting to that point.
Yeah.
But that's where a lot of people want to be. The new construction, you can't build something and sell it for less than $450 these days, and that prices so many people out of the new construction market. They have to focus there, and there's just no way to quickly and easily build that inventory.
Yeah, Chris, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, a lot, and I want to try to not go through the whole 168 pages, but I think a couple of things that stood out to me about the study was the fact that, directly to your question to Jim, what the study found was that there are needs at all levels of the housing market. That I think was a little bit of a surprise. I think when we went in, we kind of thought where Jim was going, right? It's that 150 to 250 kind of starter home Levittown model. That's what we need.
Yeah.
Yes. We also need a whole bunch of senior housing. We also need more high-end housing because there's a huge demand for it. We also need multifamily, very low income housing. That need is across the entire income spectrum. And I think that was a little bit of a surprise to me. The other thing is that there's the United Way uses a metric or a rubric called ALICE. It's asset limited, low income constrained employed. Asset limited income constrained employed individuals, ALICE. What that's a metric for is that for policy reasons that are esoteric and kind of silly, frankly, the federal government hasn't really updated the poverty measure since Jimmy Carter. Because nobody wants to be the president when poverty doubles in the United States, right? So we use a fake metric for measuring real poverty in the United States. So using the poverty level to say who is struggling is really, in my opinion, not all that accurate or all that informative. But Alice is a much better model for it. And what it does is it looks at what percentage of your household income goes to things like housing, childcare, groceries, transportation, and then looks at what's left and can you survive on what's left. When you take the picture of the housing assessment that was created for us by Urban Partners and you overlay the United Way Alice data, what you find is that our families in Ontario County are spending much more of their household income on housing than is really kind of healthy. And that leaves the rest of their entire life constrained because such a big portion of it is going to housing. And that's when we run into people who are struggling to put food on the table for their family because they're paying 50% of their household income just to put a roof over their family's head, right? And so that becomes an interesting part because those folks are the folks that Ryan was talking about. Those are the folks that are going to work at our manufacturers, are going to work in our agricultural community. And so what we're finding is they're moving to Wayne County, to Seneca County, to Livingston County. But then we've got this vacuum of employees that are needed for our economy that don't have the wherewithal or are going to have to drive past 3 other places where they could be employed to come back to their place of employment in Ontario County. So it's an economic issue for us as well as an equity and a community and a social issue. It's a huge economic issue for us of these people are an integral part of what makes Ontario County an awesome place to live and work and visit. But we can't price them out of that community. They need to be a part of this community. And that's really kind of the get away from the nuts and bolts of economic development and real estate and development and land use. It's how do we continue to make this a community and keep it as a vibrant community? And I think that's like the overarching goal of all this.
Yeah, and if I can just add, I think when we talk about housing and economic development, there's a initial reaction that we're talking about bringing people into the community, which is not necessarily the case. The biggest problem was people who live here, who've grown up here, who want to stay here but can't. And I think Chris is right on. That is a huge, huge problem, and we are forcing people out of our community because we're not solving this housing need.
Yeah, and I want to just sort of shift here and talk a little bit about the reaction to the data that's in the report. Ryan, you mentioned it a little bit, that you mentioned the meeting that you thought maybe a half dozen or a dozen people would show up and you saw 50 people standing in front of you. As you guys have had time to digest everything that's in the report, what's the public reaction been to it?
It's been mixed. The funny part about that meeting in Bloomfield, and it's carried through in other different public sessions that we've had, and there's been a few. A third of that room was very much probably had been in their house for 25, 30 years, probably made their last payment years ago, and doesn't see the issue. And we don't need any more people in Bloomfield or in Canandaigua or Phelps. And sitting right next to them is their neighbor who has a son or daughter, niece or nephew that's desperately trying to get back here. And said, no, we absolutely need a place for them to live. So watching that unfold in a public setting was really interesting. And I think the smart thing that we did there, and it was totally by accident, was that we didn't have an elected official doing the meeting. So everybody in that room felt very comfortable telling me what they thought. And Supervisor Willie was able to sit in the audience and hear all sides of it, which I think was valuable to him. As a matter of fact, I know it was because he told me. So I think that the reaction to the data has been exactly what you think it's going to be. Those that are looking or trying to help somebody look for a place know there's a problem. And those that have a place haven't felt that issue yet. And I think that's the important part of when we have these public conversations, and this here is to tell the story, not just of the economics of it and our business owners need more employees, so we should really help them out. But there's some real family issues going on, and it's hey, I want to go to school at Mid-Lakes, because who doesn't want to go to school at Mid-Lakes? But there's not a place in Phelps and Clifton available right now to move into.
Yeah. And continuing on, Ed there, go ahead.
Yeah, it's really interesting that if you're in the market to buy or rent, there's a crisis. If you're not so sure. And your reaction is, I kind of like the fact that my home is worth a lot more now than it was 5 years ago. So when you talk about we're going to put this big effort to moderate price increases or lower prices, there's a reaction like, well, I'm not so sure that's okay for me. So the reactions are definitely mixed depending on which seat you're in. But Chris mentioned the senior housing. I think what we haven't hit yet is there are a large number of baby boomers who are in single family homes that are larger than they need, and they can't find a place to go that's either available or affordable. So they stay. And we're getting to that point where now they maybe are getting to deferring maintenance, not putting as much effort into it. And when they do move, whether they're forced or by choice, we may end up with a housing stock that needs a lot of work. So we're creating future problems at the same time we're not solving today problems. And that, I think the broad-based cross the spectrum focus is the right one, because we need a little bit of everything, maybe a lot of everything, but we can't focus on one segment and ignore the others, because that just delays the problem, 4, 5, 10 years.
Yeah, and Chris, I want to pick your brain on this one, because the first thing that comes to mind when we're talking about this question of folks who are insulated from the housing crisis that exists, I immediately start to think about, well, what is the tax base going to look like in 10 or 15 or 20 years? As an administrator of an entire county, probably something you're thinking about regularly. Is that front of mind when you're thinking about something like this?
It's a component of it, but I wouldn't say it's front of mind. Because as Jim's alluded to a couple times now, because the disparity between supply and demand, values of homes are going up. So that increases our tax base even without adding a whole bunch of new units. So from a local government funding perspective, that is kind of taking care of itself to a certain degree. Now, Ontario County, we've got a fascinating set of problems before us, because we're one of a very few upstate counties who are actually growing in population. So we kind of have this natural growth that we need to accommodate, but then we also have the ongoing issue that we're not accommodating as much growth as we know there is demand for. And so because those things are kind of working in the background, we're not looking at this through a government sustainability lens like a lot of other rural counties are. Again, we're using the overlay of the community lens, and I'm surprised Ryan didn't steal this one from me because of his past life as a school board president. But I look at it as the amount of funding, but also community effort we put into our K through 12 schools to educate our young people, and then we're the sponsor for Finger Lakes Community College. And a lot of our K through 12 grads go to Finger Lakes Community College to get their associate's degree or to then move on and get a bachelor's degree. We're not able to retain them. And the number of people who work with Ryan and I who have kids who came up through school districts in Ontario County, who went to FLCC or elsewhere, and who in their mid-20s wanted to move back to Ontario County to start their family and couldn't. And so we put all of this societal capital into these young folks, and now we're sending them out into the world when they want to come home. Some portion of them, at least, I'm not saying everyone does, but some portion of them want to come home, and we're making it hard for them. So they're ending up in Brighton or in Macedon or Allentown, Pennsylvania, too. One of my good friends, 2 of his kids ended up down there. We're missing out. And where that translates to the school districts is, as we've talked a couple of times, our 65 plus population has increased disproportionately quickly in Ontario County compared to the demographics in the rest of the country. So everybody's getting older. That baby boomer bubble is kind of coming up through, but we are increasing in that senior market faster than everyone else. But that doesn't help our K through 12 schools. So you might have a school district where the overall population of the district has increased, but the number of pupils is going down. That's more, it's at that school funding level where that funding and the viability of the school districts moving forward becomes an issue, because as Ryan can be far more eloquent than I can on your cost per pupil is not a straight line. And as your number of students goes down, that expense doesn't come down in a linear fashion, right? So now those smaller school districts are really struggling to provide the same level of high education to these kids when there just aren't enough kids to spread that cost out over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember as a school board president pre-COVID, the biggest issue that we had at Phelps Clifton, and it's not just Phelps Clifton, it's Geneva, Canandaigua, Marcus Whitman, Naples, Bloomfield, was it was butts and seats, right? That was the issue of the day. We needed to make sure that we could market ourselves to families to come to our area so we could fill our classrooms. Because you can't tax enough to cover a drop in state aid. And that formula is done on who's in your building. So it's very real and scary for our school districts now. When you get outside of really just the Victor school district is where the growth has been. The rest of the county has seen pretty sustained loss over a decade and a half.
And I think maybe I'd have to look at the newsletter, but I think Canandaigua has stabilized a little bit. But this goes back to your earlier question, Josh, about kind of the perception that people have about the housing issue. So if they're not looking for a house, or they don't have a loved one or a relative who's looking for a house, and they live or work in that, what we call kind of the development corridor of Victor, Farmington, Canandaigua,
yeah,
they're driving through Canandaigua and up 332 through Farmington, and they see building everywhere. And so they're like, well, there's got to be enough. Well, Canandaigua has increased, the school district has increased in population, but it's just kind of holding the line on enrollment. And that's where, we're getting a lot of senior developments in Canandaigua. So we got people moving in, but they don't have kids to send through the school district. And that's that perception issue. And they look around, we don't need more development. It's everywhere. What do we possibly need it for? But it's not, again, getting back to that issue of needing different types of development, all kind of across geographically, across socioeconomic strata, and across the different offerings in the real estate market to fill that overall need.
That's a great segue, because the next question I had was just that about misconceptions. And I think the development one is a really good point. People will drive up 332 through Farmington towards Victor, and they'll think, things are great. Yep. Things are popping off. It's awesome. But that isn't a complete picture of the health of Ontario County. When it comes to the housing study itself, what are the biggest misconceptions that you guys have come across and heard from some of these listening sessions where you guys have actually talked to people who live in, say, Bloomfield or Honeywell or some of these other communities?
Well, in a lot of ways, it's exactly that. We have less people here. Geneva's a really good example. There's less people in Geneva than what there was, 25, 30 years ago. But it was actually Tom Harvey took some of the data that we had through the study and then used some of the information he had through the planning department and put even more slides together, where the last housing boom in Geneva was in the 50s. So you're looking at an older housing stock. And quite honestly, a lot of people aren't looking to Geneva because of it's an older housing stock. And a lot of people don't believe that. It's not something that you feel driving to Wegmans, right? And you have to have that hard data to support it. So I think that would be one misconception that has come through in a lot of the public meetings.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And similar to that, there was, and I forget the number off the top of my head, but I want to say it was about 12 or 1,500 housing units were identified through a high-level data analysis, so that eyes weren't laid on every single one. But I think there were 12 or 1,500 housing units that were basically abandoned or dilapidated to the point that they were not inhabited. You don't get that sense driving around the county, right? You don't drive past an intersection and see a boarded up old farmhouse. And our consultants, I remember having the conversation with them where they really leaned into that. And they said, that needs to be one of your top priorities, because to Jim's earlier point, you can't build anything cheap enough to serve that middle market, but you can rehab something. And so we should really focus our efforts there. And I remember going, where the heck are you guys coming up with this? I don't know where those are. And they walked us through the methodology, and it was pretty sound. And so I'm sure that number will change a little bit when you actually go and put boots on the ground. But there's a good number of housing units that are not in service, for lack of a better term, and that need significant improvements. And that was a surprise for me. And I don't know that that's a conception that a lot of people have, that we might have 1,000+ housing units that are just basically abandoned and idle.
Yeah. And Jim, I guess just for your perspective here, what would that mean to the housing market if, say, 500 to 1,000 of these units all of a sudden over the course of a couple of years came online? What kind of difference would that make?
I mean, it's a massive difference. The problem right now is there's no ability for movement, natural movement to occur. So your family's growing, you need a bigger house. So you're an empty nester, you want to move into something smaller scale. Typically, there was just this natural turnover of a neighborhood, and people had the ability to move when and where they wanted for the housing that was appropriate to them. Like I mentioned before, there's such a shortage in this middle market that it's squeezing everybody else. And so if we could add 1,000 units somewhere in from 100 to 400, it creates opportunity for movement. And as long as some of it is senior housing, if we can get seniors a comfortable, affordable, reasonable place to live, it frees up all of those single family homes that they're just sitting on because they have no other place. So that creates opportunity. It lets people move out of the rental into home ownership. It opens up rental opportunities, moderates rental prices for lower income people. It just makes everybody's housing a little more attainable, a little less expensive, and provides them the appropriate housing for their needs.
I think one other scary one, at least from a staff level, having kind of worked without a net for some of these early public outreach forums, has been one of the things that I heard in Bloomfield the first time and others since is, well, the county's coming here to tell us you have to put single family blue houses on Elm Street, and that's what you're doing here. And I think, well, Chris has made sure, because Tom Harvey and I have been, I guess, appointed to be the face of the public outreach, which is pretty scary in its own right. But, we have to remind ourselves when we go into every one of these, is the first thing we have to say, and we get it right out on the table quick, is we're here, the county's here to support whatever your municipality wants to do. That's your decision. We're just going to help you. And Tom can help work through some of the planning and zoning if you want to make a change. I can help match developer to community if you want that type of development. We're not there to force it on anybody. And I think that's surprising to some people because there's a bit of skepticism when they walk into that room. Obviously, the county's here to start hammering boards together, and that's just not what we're going to do.
The idea, right, is to facilitate and potentially speed up the process for anyone who is interested, right?
That's right.
Okay, so Chris, let's just jump in here. The home rule has a little bit of say in this whole process, what the county could even do if it wanted to get carried away here, which it doesn't want to. So talk to us a little bit about how home rule comes into play and why that is effectively a really good guardrail for anybody who is concerned about the county stepping in and telling anyone in any small town or village, you have to do this.
Sure. No, it's a great question, Josh. So New York is a home rule state. And what that really means at the most granular level is that land use decisions are up to the towns and villages and cities. And so we've been very clear, and that's the reason that we undertook this effort as a housing assessment. We didn't even want to call it a study or a plan because we wanted to make it really clear from the outset that all we were trying to do was to quantify the issue and to put data on the table and to really spur the discussion. And to Ryan's earlier point, we've been explicit with the Board of Supervisors. We've been very direct. Every community group we've engaged with this, where we as the county cannot, because of home rule, it is out of our purview. We cannot drive housing policy at a local level. What we're here to do is facilitate the discussion and be a resource if and when any municipality decides they want to do something. And it can look a lot of different ways. We've got Jim at the table, we've got Ryan, but they can bring developers to the table. We've got planning experts on the second floor of our building that can go out and talk to the zoning and planning boards about, well, how is your existing planning local laws maybe holding you back from what you want to see as a community? And how can you maybe tweak those to get what your community wants in terms of development? And then we've got some other creative things that we can do in terms of grant funding, conversations about infrastructure and how the county might be a partner with a municipality to extend a water or a sewer line somewhere, those kind of things. And so what we're trying to do is just, again, set the table, have the discussion, and then make it very clear that if and when a municipality says, yeah, we'd like to do this, but we're not sure how, that's what we can help with. And if a municipality says, we're good, thank you, no problem. We've got other towns and villages that we will work with if they want to, but we can't and we won't come in and say, you know what, Bloomfield, you really need to put a 9-story high rise right here on 5 and 20. That would be perfect. It's not feasible.
Yeah. And the idea that any housing development that happened in any of these communities that doesn't fit with local character would be, that's just wouldn't happen, right?
It wouldn't. And it's because of the way New York is structured municipally in terms of they have the say, but it's also, again, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but we're coming at it through a community lens. We don't want to try to solve this problem and undermine the sense of community that we're trying to actually further, right? So anything that we do, we want to make sure that the municipality has buy-in, because that's the only way it's going to work through that overall goal of helping to strengthen our community.
All right. So now let's look forward. What's next in this process, Ryan? What do we have any meetings coming up? How can folks get engaged with what you guys are doing? Questions, complaints?
Yeah, the calendar filled up pretty quick after the first ad hoc meeting. We're going to meet just off of the Board of Supervisors schedule, right? Every 3 weeks is what we decided to start this, which is a pretty aggressive calendar.
Yeah.
But it has to be. The one thing we learned from the first meeting, because it was very much let's get it all out on the table, we're probably 2 meetings away from actually having it all out on the table. We're going to have a public outreach. Tom and I are doing a presentation to the City of Geneva City Council. I think they're doing it as a workshop meeting. That's on the 26th of this month. And we're hoping to start taking orders from other municipalities that want us to come in and do our show. Tom and I are wildly entertaining. So
It's a bit like Abbott and Costello. Pretty good.
So we're hoping that more will take advantage of it, because the education piece is such a huge component of this. So the residents of a town can understand that it's not Big Brother just coming down and telling them this is what you're going to build and where you're going to build it. And the developers have been great with this too, because the one thing that developers have told us and in my department over the past 6 or 8 months is it's cheaper for us to work with the municipality before we even put pen to paper. So it'll make it more affordable for whoever moves in there, but it's an easier process too. We're not adversarial when we get to the zoning and planning board. We've already talked through, hey, we'd like to see this type of development in Canandaigua, and we'd like to see it in this general area. And if there's land available in that spot and the infrastructure's in the ground, then we can really have a conversation. And I think the more municipalities hear that and the more they follow that process, I think the better off we'll be.
And the report is available for anybody who's interested in reading a 168-page report on the housing situation in Ontario County. It is on the county's website, right? So check it out. Right? I think that would be a good idea for anybody who's curious about this kind of stuff. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here today, and we'll definitely be doing it again.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Josh.
Thank you, Josh. We appreciate the opportunity.